Madam is Senior Consultant and Head at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Hospital, Department of OBGYN, and she's also the Chairperson of the Reproductive Endocrinology Committee of POGD and the Vice President of Delhi Gynae Forum Southwest. So, ma'am, can we please start?
Thank you, Swasti. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mitali, Max Hospital, AOGD, and ICOG for giving us this platform to do this webinar. And I'm really honored to have Dr. Achala Batra, President-elect AOGD, and Dr. Jyotsna Suri, Vice President-elect AOGD with us today to encourage us. First of all, I will like to thank ICOG for giving us 1 credit point for this CME. And I take this as an opportunity to ask all of my delegates to kindly give inputs and contribute towards cervical cancer and breast cancer prevention. FOXI President has given a call for that. So on this Women's Day on 8th March, we are conducting various pap smears and breast examination camps in various hospitals. So I will like all of you to contribute for that cause. Dr. Sushma is our, chairperson of breast and cervical cancer prevention of AOGD. So first of all, I welcome my guest of honor, Dr. Achala Batra. Can I have her CV, please? Dr. Achala Batra is the President-elect of AOGD. Mitali, please share ma'am CV. Mitali? Yeah. Dr. Achala Batra CV. Yeah. Ma'am is President-elect AOGD 21-22. She has been President NARCHI 2018 and 20, Honorary Secretary AOGD 2015 to 16, Editor-in-Chief in 2008 and 9. She has honored the Chair of Urogyne Committee AOGD 19 to 21. Madam has conducted various CME programs under her, and she has been active in AOGD and NARCHI for a long period. She has got a long and very, very brilliant CV to her credit. Madam has been a PG and UG teacher for last 35 years and has conducted many research projects and written various books on obs and gynae. She has contributed several chapters in various textbooks, and she's been resource person in several guideline books for Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So we welcome you, Achala ma'am. We'd like to hear we would like you to give us some words of encouragement, ma'am.
Thank you, Anitya. Thank you for the kind words. And I'm really happy to be part of this CME, which is less talked about, the interplay of hormones and cancer and borderline tumors, both which are very important, but many people don't know much about them. As we all know, hormones are important in female cancer. If you take HRT, you are more prone to, breast cancer. Estrogen taking makes you more prone to cancer of the endometrium after menopause. There are some cancers which secrete hormones. There are some hormones which will help you in cancer. So there are various aspects to cancer and hormones together. And it will be really nice to hear about it from you. And the second topic, the borderline ovarian tumor, I think is also very important. People should know that they don't have to do unnecessary surgery for borderline tumors. So I think both the topics have been very well chosen. And I wish you a very grand success in your CME. And I think people are really going to benefit from it. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Achala ma'am. Thank you for these words of encouragement. Our next guest of honor is none other than Dr. Jyotsna Suri. Dr. Jyotsna Suri, welcome. Dr. Jyotsna Suri is Professor, Department of OBGYN at VMMC and Safdarjung Hospital. She is in charge of critical care obstetrics at VMMC and Safdarjung Hospital. She is going to be Vice President in coming years to 21-22. She is National Corresponding Editor, Jogi, 21-23. Chairperson, Safe Motherhood Committee, we were fortunate to have her as chairperson. She has conducted so many CMEs on various critical care obstetric topics during her tenure. She has been chairperson multidisciplinary committee AOGD for 2016 and 18. And she has been in charge of critical care obstetrics since 16. She is faculty for National Board of Examination, Delhi University, IP University. She has authored many books, edited many books, contributed several chapters and textbooks of Obs and Gynae. She has delivered more than 200 guest lectures in various national and international conferences. She is awardee of so many prizes and fellowships. She has been a co-investigator for maternal morbidity project with LSTM and WHO sponsored projects. So, Dr. Jyotsna, we will like to hear from you.
Thank you, Dr. Anita, for such kind words. And I would like to congratulate the Gynae Endocrinology Committee of AOGD and DGF Southwest for taking up this topic, which is, as Dr. Achla has just mentioned, it is something which is not often discussed, but it is so very important and has got more relevance today when we are approaching the Women's Day. Something which is so important when the theme is, preventing cancers. We are all looking after, the screening. So here are some, very important pearls which you will be, I'm sure, touching upon today about common things, about the hormones which are actually, having such a double-edged sword. They are so beneficial, but then at the same time can be responsible for causing cancers. And then as treatment also, so it is actually a very exciting topic which is not often discussed. So I'm sure all the participants who attend today are going to have a very good experience with gaining lot of knowledge. And even the second topic is something, which is very challenging for all of us. What to do, what are the latest guidelines, how to manage a borderline tumor. I think it is going to be a scientific feast. So congratulations once again. And I wish that this session will be a very great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jyotsna. And I take this as an opportunity to, to be honored by presence of my various chairperson, Dr. Mrinalini Mani, Dr. Leena Sridhar, Dr. Sushma Sinha, and I'm sure Dr. Shashi is going to join soon. And I welcome all my dear delegates who have logged in to hear us. Thank you so much. I hand over desk to Dr. Swasti now to introduce the chairperson for the first scientific session.
So the first session today will be on hormones and cancer interplay. This will be chaired by Dr. Mrinalini Mani. Madam is the head of the department OBGYN, GGS Government Hospital, Government of NCT of Delhi. She is currently the president of Delhi Gynae Forum Southwest, a FOXY committee member for breast and AOGD committee member, reproductive and endocrinology committee, multidisciplinary committee, breast and cervical cancer awareness screening and prevention committee. She is the secretary, Mission Pink Health, IOGD West Town, a national assessor quality and mentor Lakshya program, Government of India aims. Member, Delhi State Committee for AEFI COVID Surveillance, member, State Advisory Subcommittee, Health Niti Aayog. He is providing key and technical managerial support for various maternal public health programs and training and capacity building for health-related activities by the state of Delhi. She is the faculty, National Board of Education, e-learning for family medicine, the editorial board member for PPMPL Journal of OBG Research and Practice, a guest speaker and faculty in national CMEs, workshops, conferences all across conducted by various bodies. She has numerous publications in national and international journals with contributions to books, Foxy Committee, edited books and awarded by the APJ Abdul Kalam Excellence Award in 2020, a Wonder Foxian Award 2019, Sankalp Champion.
सर मैंने आपका वो देखा था, मेल देखा था
Contraception and Women's Reproductive Health. She's also certificate of appreciation by the Foxy. Welcome, madam. Mitali, can you please mute?
Thank you very much, Dr. Swasti. Can you ask organizers to mute everyone except the speaker?
Yeah. Mitali, can you please mute everybody while... Yeah, thank you. Welcome, ma'am, to chair this session. May I request Mitali to please show me the next slide. I want to welcome Dr. Sushma Sinha. Ma'am is the head of the department and senior specialist government of NCT of Delhi. She is the AOGD subcommittee chairperson for Breast and Cervical Cancer Awareness Screening and Prevention Committee 2020 to 2022. She's the chairperson Mission Pink Health IOGD West Town, executive women Dr. Wing IMA, executive member Breast Committee Foxy, North Zone coordinator FWC Foxy, vice president Delhi Gynae Forum Southwest, District Nodal MTP Committee, District TOT Trainer of Trainees for Contraception, Care Around Birth and Lakshya Programs. She is the life member of IMA, AOGD, NARCHI, BPNI, life member and patron of PCOS Society. She is the IMA National President. She won the IMA National President's Appreciation Award in 2019 and also the Wonder Foxian Award 2019 at a World Conference on Contraception to Delivery 2019. She was awarded the Certificate of Appreciation for the year 2016 to 2017 at ABGH Hospital. She also won the first prize in West Delhi for Family Planning Services on World Population Day 2017. She has numerous publications in both national and international journals, including Indian Journal of Clinical Practice, International Journal of Reproduction, Contraception, Obs and Gynae, International Journal of Medical Science and Innovative Research, Biomedical Journal of Scientific and Technical Research, and British Journal of Obs and Gynae. Her areas of interest are contraception, medico-legal aspects, and public awareness. Welcome, ma'am. So I hand over the mic to our chairpersons, Dr. Mrinalini ma'am and Dr. Sushma ma'am, for conducting of this session.
I must thank Dr. Mrinalini and Dr. Sushma. They are the revered president and vice president of our forum. Yes. So welcome Dr. Mrinalini and Dr. Sushma once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nita, for those kind words. And can we have the introductory slide of the speaker, please, Dr. Swasti?
Yeah. Mitali, can you please share your screen again?
So Dr. Nita is a speaker, and she would be speaking upon a very untouched topic, as already mentioned by Dr. Batra and Dr. Josna Suri, regarding the interplay of hormones and cancers. What role do hormones have in cancers? And rightly, as rightly pointed out, hormones and cancers, a lot of hormones are there which themselves are positive agents and are a part of the etiological pathogenesis, or they change the course of these cancers, or they also have a role in management of these female cancer, for example, breast cancer and other cancers. And Dr. Anita Rajoria, I'm sure she'll be doing justice to this topic. And as we all know her, she's a very esteemed speaker in a lot of forums, which we have these on the webinars. And at present, she is the head of the department of Obs and Gynae in Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Hospital, government of the NCT of Delhi. And she is associated with a lot of forums, among the prominent ones being Asia and Oceania Federation of Obs and Gynae and Foxy, and Delhi Medical Forum. She's the vice president of Southwest Forum. And she is also the chairperson of the Reproductive Endocrinology Infertility Committee of Reform and of Foxy as well. She can we mute, please? There's a lot of disturbance right now. And I request all the participants to mute themselves, please. And to carry on, and she has a participant in a lot of training programs. She's a master trainer for a lot of programs, the Government of India programs like Lakshya and Saath, and also for sexual assault survivors. And she has a faculty, as we see her these days, at various international, national, and state level conferences, and at our Delhi level conference of OGB and DGF. she has also won many awards, and they are most, and we all know that she is very good at slogan writing, and she has won many awards in this competition and slogan, which is her forte actually. Name it, and she will immediately come out with a slogan. And she's also recipient of Under Foxing Award and BGF Appreciation Award. She has many publications to herself, and coming between Dr. Anita and her presentation, I would also say she's a dear friend, and I'm sure that we'll be a great learning journey today with her. Over to you, Dr. Anita.
Thank you, Dr. Minali. Thank you for those kind words. So I'll share my screen. So today I'll be talking about hormones and cancer interplay. What are the recent concepts of cause and effect, a relationship between hormones and cancer? So this is the outline of my presentation. What is the role of hormones in oncogenesis? Role of hormones in management of cancer, that means treatment of cancer. Effect of cancer treatment on hormonal milieu. Then what are the endocrinopathies, which are long-term sequelae, and how do we tackle them? What are the future perspectives of hormones and cancer, and what are the carry-home messages? So we all know that hormones do have a role in etiopathogenesis of some endocrine-related cancers. They may affect clinical course and prognosis of malignancy, and may be used as endocrine therapy in management of some hormone-dependent malignancies. Now, the other side of the coin incorporates effects of various cancers on hormonal milieu of body, effect of cancer treatment on hormones, and long-term sequelae related to these hormonal derangements. Now, role of hormones in etiopathogenesis of cancer has been known for a long time. We all understand that excessive hormonal stimulation of proliferative cells increases the risk of their mutation and then multiplication of these mutant clones. Hormones are definitely powerful and complete carcinogens, as they are able to initiate and propagate cancer. So what are the various types of endocrinal or hormone-related cancers we know? They may be of various types. What are endocrine-related cancers? Then they may be hormone-dependent cancers or hormone-responsive or endocrine-sensitive cancers. Endocrine-related cancers are the cancers which originate from the endocrine organs, such as thyroid, pituitary, hypothalamus, pancreas, and primary and secondary sex organs, etc. Hormone-dependent cancers are those who are dependent on sex steroids. For example, cancer breast and cancer endometrium in females, and prostate and testicular cancer in males. Hormone responsive or endocrine sensitive cancers, these involve cancers which show response to pituitary hormones like ovarian and thyroid cancers. Understanding of hormones as one of the causative factors of malignancy is important, as it becomes the basis and it helps us in developing treatment for various sex steroid dependent tumors in form of anti-estrogen and anti-androgenic treatments. Various lifetime variables which affect the exposure of human body to available sex steroids thereby gains relevance. Now, what are the different lifetime variables which change the steroid exposure of our body? Age of menarche, early menarche, late menopause, age at first pregnancy, parity of the women, duration of breastfeeding and presence of obesity, exposure to endocrine disruptors. Exogenous hormonal therapy and menopausal hormone therapy may be other contributing factors. And another emerging concept is chemoprevention of cancer by hormones. Some some of the cancers can be prevented, especially which are endocrine related. For example, we all know use of tamoxifen in patients who are predisposed to breast cancer. The role of genetic predisposition and epigenetics in causation of hormone-related cancers due to germ-like polymorphism has also been addressed. Now, what are the various hormones which affect or cause causing factor for malignancy? Now, like metabolic hormones. Let's talk about metabolic hormones first. Diabetes and obesity, these are the major preventable and modifiable factors which are related to hormonal etiopathogenesis of malignancy. Then insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, they also contribute and change the prognosis of malignancy. Epigenetics plays a role, and lifestyle modifications by diet and exercise can modulate the genetic predisposition. We must understand that drugs which cause weight gain and insulin resistance, for example, antidepressant, anti-epileptic, cisplatin-based chemotherapy, they all alter the prognosis and course of malignancy by their insulin resistance and weight gain causation. Now, aromatase inhibitors and anti-androgens also contribute to the treatment resistance. Development of insulin resistance may interfere with the effects of cancer treatment. Other metabolic hormones which are associated with obesity, they are increased leptin levels and reduced adiponectin levels. Now, leptin may induce carcinogenesis directly or by enhanced expression and more estrogen production, while reduced adiponectin also causes or increases cancer risk. Vitamin D deficiency, we all know, it is known to worsen insulin resistance, and it is known to increase aromatase activity, leading to more estrogen production and thereby causing malignancy or adding on to it. Now, implications of thyroid hormone in carcinogenesis. We all know that TSH causes metastasis in differentiated thyroid cancer, which becomes the basis of TSH suppressive therapy with levothyroxine in patients of differentiated thyroid cancer. Iodine deficiency leading to endemic goiter makes an individual more responsive to mitogenic effects of TSH. TSH receptor stimulating antibodies in Graves' disease, they increase thyroid cancer risk and aggressiveness of cancer. Thyroid follicular cancer cells have ER alpha, ER beta, and GPER estrogen receptors, making females more prone to thyroid malignancy. Overexpression of IR and IGF-IR by thyroid cell increases the risk in obesity and insulin resistance. At molecular level, upgradation of hormone-dependent or initiated steroid signaling, membrane-initiated steroid signaling, MISS, due to cellular stimulation by estrogen has been shown in cancer cells. G protein coupled receptor family is known to increase the transcriptional events in cancer cells when stimulated by hormones. GPER expression happens both in ER positive and ER negative breast cancer cells, endometrial carcinoma, ovarian malignancy, and thyroid cancer. This expression leads to malignancy and is the basis for estrogen treatment, that is tamoxifen, which is a partial ER antagonist, and also acts as GPR agonist. These are the various ways of endocrinal carcinogenesis. We know that hormones, they cause expansion of stem cell pooling in perinatal age itself. They are known to enhance effects of mutagens, and they accelerate and cause proliferation and decrease the apoptosis of mutated cells. They bring about epigenetic changes in pre and perinatal life, and they affect on insulin. They increase the effect of insulin and insulin-like growth factor on cell biology. So hormones in etiopathogenesis of gynae cancer. We all know estrogens are known to be human carcinogens. Historically, diethylstilbestrol given to pregnant females between 1940 and 1971 to prevent miscarriage and premature labor, it increased the risk of breast cancer in the females. Their daughters had increased incidence of clear cell adenocarcinoma, vagina, cervix, and breast cancer, especially after 40 years. And even granddaughters were found to be at high risk. So this DES is now considered an endocrine disrupting chemical, which causes problems in endocrine system, may lead to malignancy, besides causing lot of developmental abnormalities. And this has become a basis of hormonal transplacental carcinogenesis studies. There are many other endocrine disruptors we know, environmental pollution, etc., and bisphenol A, etc., used in plastics. So now let us discuss about relationship between oral contraceptive use and cancer. What about breast cancer? A large prospective Danish study in 2017 reported a 20% increase in the relative risk of breast cancer in women who were on or had recently stopped using OCPs in comparison to women who had never used the OCPs. This diagnosis may be related to increased surveillance of these patients, and it depends on the type of OCP used and the duration of its usage also. What about cervical cancer? OCPs, when used for 5 years or more, they increase cervical cancer risk in comparison to non-users, and this risk is proportional to the duration of the use of oral pills. The risk declines over the time when the usage is stopped. This increase of cervical cancer risk may be due to increased susceptibility of cervical cells following OCP use to the persistent high-risk HPV infection, which itself causes cervical malignancy. Now, endometrial cancers. OCPs have been known to be used, and they are said to be reducing the risk by 30%, and it is proportionate to the duration of use of OCPs. The risk reduction was more obvious in the obese, sedentary women, and the protective effect persisted for many years even after stoppage of OCPs. Ovarian cancer. Regarding ovarian cancer, OCP use has 30% to 50% lower risk than non-users, and it is proportional to the use of duration of use, and effects of risk reduction continue even after stopping. Some protective effect of OCP use has been observed in areas of BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene mutation also. The protective effect is due to suppression of ovulation-like protection, which is rendered by parity and lactation. Regarding colorectal cancer and oral pill use, there is 20% lower risk of development of colorectal cancers in OCP users. This is related to bile acid metabolism and presence of estrogen receptors on epithelial cells, which inhibit cell proliferation. OCPs were found to cause risk reduction in development of adenomatous polyps, which itself is a pre-malignant lesion. Now, fertility treatment with hormones and risk of cancer. Infertility itself is related to increased risk of breast, ovarian, and endometrial cancer. We all know that assisted reproductive technologies involve use of multiple hormones for down regulation, control ovarian hyperstimulation, ovulation trigger, and then progesterone support in luteal phase and early pregnancy. This had raised concerns regarding cancer linked to supraphysiological levels of these hormones. However, no increased risk of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, or endometrial cancer were found in women who were treated with these fertility drugs. Now, we have discussed role of OCPs and its interplay with development of malignancy or its use in various cancers. Now, we will discuss menopausal hormone therapy and its role in development of cancer. MHT and HRT. usually involves treatment with either estrogen alone or estrogen with progesterone, which may be synthetic. Some bioidentical hormones are being sold through internet, which are not still approved. The concerns of MHT use in various cancers we are going to discuss. What about ovarian cancer? HRT has to be given with caution in these females as they may have estrogen and progesterone receptors. What about breast cancer? MHT use in breast cancer, recent studies have concluded that women who took estrogen plus progesterone were more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer in comparison to placebo. The breast cancer in these women, they were larger and more spread to lymph node were observed at the time of diagnosis. The risk increased with duration of use, but fell remarkably after stopping the MHT. So Tibolone and Raloxifene were found to be good alternatives as MHT in these women. It was also noted that use of MHT made mammography less effective for detection of breast cancer and required much more biopsies because it increased the density of the breast. Higher breast cancer mortality rates were observed in women who took progesterone along with estrogen than estrogen alone. And it was more than in placebo. It was also observed that breast cancer detected within 5 years of HRT are amenable to treatment as they are usually ER and PR positive. Now, MHT and endometrial cancer. Low-grade malignancy may be given HRT in required cases if the disease-free interval has been more than 2 years. MHT and lung cancer, the risk was comparable with non-users. And regarding colorectal cancers, no strong evidence of increase was found with estrogen alone or estrogen and progestin combination in development of colorectal cancer or its tumor stage or diagnosis or death. Findings from WHI study, they found that women with an intact uterus had similar risk of invasive breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and vaginal cancer in comparison to women who were using vaginal estrogen versus non-users. So FDA has currently issued this advice that women should use MHT for the shortest time and with the lowest dose possible to control the menopausal symptoms, or alternative medications can be used to allay these menopausal symptoms. So now what is the role of hormones in management of cancer? We have tried to discuss the hormones as causative agents of malignancy. Now we will discuss the role of hormones as management or therapy of malignancy. Now, hormone therapy or endocrine therapy involves treating malignancies with hormones. It envisages treatments that block or alter hormones to prevent proliferation of hormone-sensitive cancers. The systemic hormone therapy works by preventing synthesis of hormones, or it blocks or prevents attachment of hormones to cancer cell, or it alters the hormone to render it ineffective. So hormonal treatment has a definite role in recurrent or metastatic cancers, including ovarian, endometrial carcinomas, and granulosa cell tumors. Types of hormonal therapy used in various cancers are having different response depending on tumor type, tumor grade, stage, and type of drug which is being used. Patients with granulosa cell tumors and endometrial sarcomas have very good response. And patients who are hormone receptor positive and have differentiated cancers, they always show better response. So some examples of hormones being used as treatment of cancers are like in breast cancers, we are using aromatase inhibitors, some estrogen receptor antagonists like fulvestrant, torimethrin, LHRH agonist, or oophorectomy is done in these patients. Similarly, for endometrial cancer, progesterone has long been considered as treatment, MPA, magistral acetate, then hormone containing intrauterine devices, some LHRH agonists, aromatase inhibitors, etc. Prostate cancers, anti-androgens have been used along with CYP inhibitors, etc. Similarly, in adrenal cancers, role of adrenolytics and estrogen receptor antagonist, etc., has been well established. Now, what are the side effects? So when we are using these hormonal therapies, hormonal treatments in females, there may be hot flushes, vaginal dryness, etc., as they experience in menopause. Similarly, in males also erectile dysfunction and systemic side effects may be there. And additionally, they may have effects like those which are occurring in females. Now, this is the third aspect. What are the long-term sequelae or endocrinopathies which develop as a treatment following cancer therapies? Now, therapy-related late effects of cancer treatment are recognized, and these endocrine disorders are the most common in them. We must understand that childhood cancer survivors develop endocrinopathies depending on their age and sex. Radiotherapy, how does it affect? It affects endocrine organs like thyroid and pituitary, and how? It causes damage of DNA and cells also, especially post total body irradiation. Similarly, effect of chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is what they call, they lead to oxidative stress and tissue damage along with vascular toxicity, and they may cause secondary malignancies also, and alkylating agents cause the most damage. Surgery and immunotherapy, they may also contribute to these long-term sequelae of cancer treatment. So these patients thereby need structured lifelong surveillance. Now there is a paradigm shift from surviving cancers to living with and beyond cancer. So the cancer survivors may present to endocrine and different multidisciplinary teams with various problems like growth hormone deficiency, functional alteration in hypothalamo-pituitary axis, abnormal thyroid and parathyroid functions, hyperprolactinemia. So we all have to give this into consideration. There may be cortisol deficiency, there may be thyroxine deficiency, and we must keep in mind that cortisol needs to be started before thyroxine to avoid adrenal crisis in these hypopituitarism patients following cancer treatment. Similarly, they may develop adrenal, pituitary, or thyroid nodule following treatment. There may be biochemical derangements like hypercalcemia, hypocalcemia, etc. And there may be menstrual abnormalities. These are important because these children or adolescents may come with delayed or early puberty, primary or secondary amenorrhea, premature ovarian insufficiency, short fertile period, infertility, so on and so forth. The pregnancy may be fraught with high risk because they may have low birth weight babies, premature labor, neonatal deaths, etc. Males also may present with delayed puberty, impotence, infertility issues, etc. They all have bone metabolism complications, cognitive and psychological issues, metabolic syndrome. These are all hormonal, long-term sequelae of various forms of cancer treatment. They may have deprivations in symptoms, as we have already discussed, like menopause. So these patients need a structured surveillance system with a multidisciplinary team and infrastructure development to provide them continuum of care. We all know that pediatric cancer survivors may need HRT for maintaining their whole health. So before starting cancer treatment of young girls, either these young adolescents, even boys, or their families, they need age-appropriate counseling, or their parents have to be counseled about their oncofertility concerns and fertility preservation options. So these are the future, at the end, I will just discuss these future perspectives, which may decrease these endocrinal effects, long-term endocrinal sequelae of cancer treatment. Development of radiation oncology. If we have 3D dimensional conformational radiotherapy or IMRT, that is intensity modulated radiotherapy, we can limit the damage caused by head and neck cancer irradiation. Similarly, identification of dose volume constraints, like how much radiation a thyroid can tolerate. So if we are able to find these dose volume constraints, then we will be able somehow to protect the endocrinal organs of these adolescents. Similarly, omic analysis like metabolomic, proteomic, transcriptional studies, they are the future strategies. They will identify who are the patients at cancer risk and which of them are having resistance to cancer therapy. Because so many patients, they get treatment, but they respond differently to our hormonal or other anti-cancer treatments. So these omic analysis may help us in future. Similarly, genetic testing, it will identify patients who are at risk for treatment complications. Like some patients do not have much side effects of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, or hormonal therapy. So which are the patients who will need more intense treatment, and they will need recommendations for smoking cessation, weight management, etc., depending on their genetic analysis. So to conclude, I will summarize once again that hormonal carcinogenesis of endocrine-related cancers is now a widely accepted concept, and most cancers are hormone sensitive at some stage of their development or progression. Endocrine therapy is important in hormone sensitive cancers for their management, and long-term structured surveillance is required for survivors of these malignancies for early detection and timely treatment of these residual endocrino or long-term endocrinopathy. So these are the references. So thank you so much. Let us all try to win the battle against malignancy by making best use of hormonal therapy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anita. Wonderful talk. At the outset, I would like to thank Max Hospital, Vaishali, Reproductive Endocrinology Committee of AOGT and DGF Southwest for having me here. And the topic chosen for today, they are very pertinent and very important. And especially the first talk, it is so very relevant, hormones and cancer interplay. It's so relevant because of the rising cases of malignancy and increasing life expectancy. For cases of and increasing life expectancy. So it is very important, and all the aspects has been very nicely dealt with, Dr. Anita. And right from the interplay and the role of hormones in treatment and the malignancy leading to hormonal disturbance, it is all very nicely dealt with. And I think a very difficult topic made very easy. And Dr. Anita, as we all know, is very enthusiastic in whatever assigned work, whatever work she is assigned with. I mean, starting from the slogan to graduating to the painting and of course the academic, she is excelling in all aspects of all aspects of life, I feel. So ever so enthusiastic she is, and this difficult topic has actually been made very easy. And this topic is very important, and it is spoken of. It is not very much spoken about because a very few platforms I have listened to this topic, and it is a very difficult topic. Thank you, Dr. Anita.
Actually, I developed interest in this particular topic when I was writing a chapter for FOXI adolescent yearbook. So they had given me topic of thieves of adolescent fertility. So I got interested into this topic because a lot of work has been done in this field regarding fertility preservation, etc., long-term fertility consequences. So this topic becomes very relevant. So I developed this interest, and then I reviewed the literature and found there are so many aspects, so many faces of coins regarding hormones and cancers. So yes. Thank you so much for giving me.
Continuous evolving science has made these things very possible, and it is a thing for today. It is the most important thing.
I would also like to add here is, as Dr. Sushma said, Dr. Anita really made it very simplified, and great take-home messages were there. Point-wise, she dealt with everything. One thing, like OCPs. We should not be scared of prescribing OCPs, because naturally we know win some, lose some. Some cancers are increased and others are, it's as a protective role as well. So basically, when we are prescribing hormones, OCPs or our MHT, we have to have a proper client selection. So client selection is very important so that we don't regret later on and we have not covered all the aspects. So we have to have a very proper history and look into those nitty-gritties when prescribing OCPs and MHTs. And because we know there are a lot of benefits of OCPs and MHT also, and vis-a-vis the side effects which they have. And also, you have very beautifully covered the management of different hormones required in management of different cancers, which we are using, which we see, and the future perspectives, the newer things which are coming have been beautifully dealt with. Thank you very much, Dr. Anita.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, case selection and follow-up of any hormone. Follow-up is very important because when to stop is
ये नहीं ना कि एक बार prescribe कर दिया फिर patient अपने आप ही लेके खाती जा रही है. ऐसा नहीं होता. That has to press that point that she has to come for follow-up. Because any other symptom she observes, she must report.
Childhood cancer survivors, their number is increasing. We are able to, manage them properly in early childhood. Even blood cancers, leukemias, they are surviving, and their, fertility aspects, they get hampered. So they need their families and these children themselves. They need counseling. So age-appropriate counseling is given to these.
And I also, like Dr. Anita mentioned in the beginning of her talk, I also take the opportunity to please request everyone to get themselves also screened, get ourselves screened actually. This is the one thing we neglect. We keep on getting our appliances and our vehicle service. What about servicing our own body? Because we have to keep fit. So I request that not only on the Women's Day the next week, but every yearly we must get our screenings also done. And डरे नहीं कि कुछ निकल आया तो फिर treat भी तो हो जाएगा ना. We will be detecting at very early stage and we will be able to treat them. So requesting everyone to get themselves screened, get all the investigations done. And we have all stalwarts here who would agree with me that screening is the best prevention. So that's a primary prevention actually. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Anita. And I thank AOGD and Max for inviting us over here.
And
so
Dr. Swati.
Yeah. Thank you, chairpersons, for your pearls of wisdom, and Dr. Anita for such a wonderful deliberation. I was mesmerized, and in fact, so much of learning from all the kind of aspects. You really made it simple. So we move on to our next session. Ma'am, please take over.
Yeah, thank you, Swasti. Thank you for those kind words. Is Dr. Shashi here? Or Dr. Leena has joined. I saw Dr. Leena Sridhar. Dr. Leena, are you there? So I will just introduce Dr. Shashi Lata Kabra Maheshwari is our Secretary of DGS Southwest. I think she is stuck up somewhere. So if she is not able to join, then I'll request Dr. Mrinalini ma'am or Dr. Sushma Sinha, please introduce Swasti. Okay, over to you, Dr. Sushma. Please introduce Swasti for next talk. Please unmute yourself.
CV is not very, very clear.
Let me introduce Dr. Swasti is a very learned, a great academician, I must say. She has been taking so many webinars and lectures regarding various aspects of gynae oncology. At present, she is a senior consultant at Max Super Specialty Hospital, Vaishali. And she has been a member of many various society, award winner. And personally, she's a very fine person, a very learned person. We will definitely like to hear from you, Swasti. Over to you. Here.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. So, Mitali, can I share my screen? Yeah. With the permission of Chair and Dr. Anita and all the dignitaries present here today, I'd like to start today's talk on borderline ovarian tumors, how clinical decisions improve outcomes. So we all are working towards improving outcomes for our women, whether it be obstetrics or high-risk pregnancy or fertility issues or oncology. So I work in Max Institute of Cancer Care, Max Vaishali, Patparganj and Noida. And I deal with gynae cancer surgical work. So a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle, said James Heller. And of course, when you look at borderline ovarian tumors, by WHO, the definition says that these are tumors which exhibit an atypical epithelial proliferative pattern, but it's more than benign counterpart, but there's no destructive stromal invasion. So what are we looking at? We are trying to identify in these tumors whether there is any destructive stromal invasion or not. And if none, then if the change is more than benign, we call them borderline. So borderline lies somewhere between benign and frankly invasive cancers. So these are also known as APT or atypical proliferative tumors or low malignant potential tumors. So, they were called as semi-malignant tumors in 1929 by Howard C. Taylor, and 1952 Kottmeyer classified semi-malignant tumors as papillary tumors and cystadenomas. So cystadenomas were also thought of as semi-malignant tumors in 1952. That's important. Now, early 70s, FIGO and WHO termed them and classified them into a separate category, which is still persistently called as a borderline or low malignant potential category. And in 1994, Kurman and Trimble showed that surgical treatment is the most effective treatment for borderline tumors, and chemotherapy and radiation are quite ineffective for the treatment. Now, WHO again classified them in 2003 into various histological types, and extra ovarian lesions started being called as implants. So we often see invasive implants, non-invasive implants. So anything which is away from the ovarian tissue and has some tumor is an extra ovarian lesion or an implant. So they comprise of about 10 to 15% of all ovarian tumors. They're usually seen in younger women, and they have an enigmatic pathogenesis. I'll talk to you a little bit about the pathogenesis because it's very interesting to revisit it. They present at an earlier age. They have a perplexing biological behavior, and usually they have a favorable prognosis. I'll share with you a lot of my experience on borderline tumors and how good or bad they can be. The risk of developing invasive carcinomas in these tumors is about 1.5%. This is textbook teaching. And sometimes, you can see ghastly change in the tumor biology. So our interventions are going to actually determine how our women are going to behave with borderline tumors. So there are three pertinent issues with borderline tumors. Number one, quality of life. Number two, reproductive function, because younger women are being taken into consideration. And number three, maintenance of endocrine function. Like Anita ma'am said very beautifully, she showed how hormones play such an important role in every aspect of a woman's life. So now look at this. This is the ovary and you've got the fimbrial end. We know now that most of serous cancers do not origin in the ovary. They don't originate in the ovary. They come from the tube. So they come from the fimbrial end, and serous cancers are developed in the normal tumoral mucosa, which undergoes a P53 signature mutation, leading to serous tubal intraepithelial carcinomas, which progress to a serous cancer, get spilled over either into the peritoneum or onto the ovarian surface and lead to ovarian serous carcinomas or primary peritoneal serous carcinomas. So now, all these fallopian tube, ovarian and peritoneal cancers are grouped into, a common pool, and they are being treated in similar lines. Now, if you look at the ovary itself, repeated inflammation will lead to a lot of type 1 tumors like clear cells, mucinous or endometrioid cancers. Before they turn into cancers, there'll be an entity which is borderline tumors. So actually a cortical inclusion cyst or endometrioma can be there, and then later on, you can have atypical proliferation and a borderline tumor can be formed, and they can progress into invasive cancers. So when you have type 1 tumors, usually the source is Mullerian metaplastic tissue. And the target cell is ciliated modified secretory epithelium. They are multifocal in spread, and they lead to more distant recurrence, and more systemic treatment is needed to control these cancers. So this is a little bit about the etiopathogenesis. And if you look at a borderline ovarian tumor per se, it can undergo a focal malignant change. There are two pathways. Pathway 1 of metastasis to extraovarian site, that is, formation of implants, and malignant cells can directly go and get implanted. Or there's a pathway 2, which is exfoliation or transport of these cells to an extraovarian site, and post implantation there is formation of an invasive implant. So it's just either lying there or it's invading and causing an invasive implant. And that's how, we learn to manage borderline tumors with or without invasive implants. So now either these two pathways, or there's a third pathway where there is a field effect. That means there is an independent tumorogenesis. You have a benign clone, a malignant clone, and there's an development of an independent malignant clone at an extraovarian site. So you may have a borderline tumor in the ovary, and you may have something else in the omentum or the peritoneum, which is actually not an implant, but it's independently developing tumor. So there are lots of genomic aberrations being studied in borderline ovarian tumors, and more than 100 genomic imbalances. And of course, we cannot ignore the way genetics and genomics studies have started coming up and helping us manage these patients. So look at, again, I come back to how these were classified, because this is important. Now you look at where you have borderline atypical proliferative tumors have with non-invasive or invasive implants, and they are classified as borderline tumors. Whereas in carcinomas, you have papillary serous carcinoma, or you have a low-grade serous cancer or a high-grade serous cancer. So this group of low-grade serous cancers are the ones which don't do so well. So they are the ones which may present with a higher tumor load, and they're not very responsive to chemotherapy. You will see a high-grade tumor, it will immediately melt with chemotherapy. So these are the ones, low-grade ones, which are difficult to treat. So you may have micropapillary pattern either on the main ovarian in borderline, or you may have invasive or a non-invasive implant. So there are three kinds of patterns which are seen in borderline tumors. Now, when you see an invasive implant, you see micropapillary architecture. So that's why micropapillary lesions are known to have little poorer prognosis. So you have serous, mucinous, endometrioid, Brenner's or clear cell kinds of borderline tumors, and the micropapillary subtype is actually 10%, and it is associated with invasive implants. It's a part of the serous group. So usually, you will see a lot of these cases being identified in stage 1. So if you see serous cancers or mucinous, all of them will be seen as a, as a little large ovarian lesion. And most of the times you will not see extraovarian disease. So if you manage these patients very optimally in this sitting, we are unlikely to upstage disease, as well as continue to give them a good survival, even up to the tune of 100% in borderline lesions. So, what are the kind of presentations that they present with? They could be asymptomatic, 23%, you could incidentally diagnose them because of some other reasons. Investigations have been done, and you find out that this is a lesion which is lying there. They may present with abdominal pain in cases of torsion, with increased abdominal girth. They think they're putting on weight, with abdominal distension or feeling of an abdominal lump. So what are the ways to non-invasively diagnose is, of course, if you have access to the vagina, then a transvaginal ultrasound is the best screening modality for all adnexal masses. Of course, if you have access to a color Doppler, then you can understand the tumoral angioarchitecture and the presence of neovascularization. Then, of course, for younger women, I will always say I would prefer to do an MR and look for septations, papillary projections, mural nodules, solid areas, right? And particularly in those in situations where you are not so sure on an ultrasound, you want to know the morphology more, right? But of course, if you're thinking of an advanced malignancy, then CT or a PET CT for staging purposes is by and large more useful. So for younger patients, we do prefer more of MR. So look at this. This is a 46-year-old a lady with an left ovarian serous cystadenoma. It's a well-defined hyper-intense lesion in the pelvis. There are no solid areas, no mural nodules. The other one is a 45-year-old with a thickening of the wall, and this came out to be a borderline serous tumor. So you may not have a solid area, is what I want to emphasize. You may just have a eccentric wall thickening. People may think this is a cystadenoma and manage it in a particular way, which I will come to. So look at this. This is a 48-year-old woman with non-invasive implants with psammomatous calcifications. And of course, these lesions can progress on to form as low-grade tumors. So this is an axial CT image, and you can see serous implants. You can see a para-umbilical serous implant on the midline. It's a calcified implant in the anterior abdominal wall. And you can also see some right paracolic invasive implants in a 37-year-old one with serous borderline ovarian tumor. So these are the kind of implants you could see even in borderline lesions. So what is important is not only to deal with the mass, it's also important to explore the rest of the abdomen and stage disease. So look at mucinous lesions. This is a large unilocular mucinous borderline tumor. There is no mural nodule, no internal septation, but the final result is a mucinous borderline tumor. And an axial CT with thick septations and mural nodules at the periphery of the lesion, and this also came out to be a mucinous borderline tumor. So if you pick up a lesion very early, you can just have wall thickening or maybe not so very, very subtle features. So what you do, serous varieties, CA125, of course. If you have a raised pre up CA125, the survival rate is lower because then definitely extravariant disease presence is higher. And if you have a low CA125 preoperatively, then your 5-year survival is higher. It's about 91% vis-a-vis 78%. Now, if you look at CEA and CA19.9, they're mostly raised in mucinous tumors, and particularly anything beyond 1B and beyond. So if you have more disease in the pelvis or in the rest of the abdomen, you're more likely to have a higher CEA and CA19.9. So I just saw a lady who had a CA19.9 of 409, and she's a breast cancer survivor. And she has about a 7 centimeter adnexal mass, which was 3 to 4 centimeters and has risen in the last 12 to 14 months. So she's not been following it in the COVID times. So just now came for follow-up, got a scan done again, and now she's about 7 centimeters from a 3 centimeters in 1 year. And none solid area. So maybe it's a borderline lesion. So I'm yet to operate on her. So I'll know in subsequent days what we find out. So again, these are the kind of that we deal with. And FIGO staging of borderline tumors is again 1, confined to ovary, 2, peritoneal implants within the pelvis, or 3, peritoneal implants beyond the pelvis or positive nodes or both, and 4 is of course a metastatic situation where you have liver parenchymal disease or disease beyond the peritoneal cavity. So life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep smiling, said Albert Einstein. And how do you balance the bicycle? So, you have something which is fertility preservation that it was just being talked about by ma'am, and fertility sparing surgery, which is a very, very interesting and a very focused way of dealing with young people with borderline tumors, where you do a unilateral adnexectomy plus or minus a contralateral cystectomy if you have cysts in both the ovaries. And but you complete the rest, or you do a cystectomy in both ovaries, depending if you've got normal ovarian tissue left. So that MR helps us to assess. And then you have to complete your staging. So you have to preserve ovarian tissue, normal ovarian tissue, and the uterus, but stage everything else. So you're going to do the washings, going to do the peritoneal biopsies, going to do the peritonectomies if needed, or omentectomies, but you're going to do only fertility preservation in situations which are early disease cancers. So usually in borderline tumors, we do get situations where we will be able to preserve fertility in over 90% patients. So if you remove the cyst versus you remove the entire tube and ovary, you will see a higher recurrence rate in cystectomy and cystectomies of 58% versus 23% in removal of tube and ovaries. Now, anytime when you counsel these patients, you have to make them understand that you find Ross disease in the abdomen anywhere else other than the ovaries, you will be shifting your decision towards a radical surgery there and then. Though you are doing an imaging, you're doing markers, you're doing all that you could, but when you're exploring, that will be the final call. So, there's a lot of process of counseling and consent that is involved. So when I said, how do we take decisions influences our outcomes? So suppose there is a 12 centimeter or a 14 centimeter or 16 centimeter mass, and you're seeing no septations, just a slight wall thickening, like the CT that I just showed you, and you don't have nodules, you don't have solid areas, and you're so tempted, you put in a scope and you aspirate and suck and put the rest of the cyst wall in the bag. The final, of course, when it goes to the pathologist, he will curse you. And of course, what he will do is he will be saying a small line which says, unable to comment on invasion. Borderline changes seen, unable to comment on invasion. The moment he will be unable to comment on invasion, you will be unsure of the diagnosis. So you don't know because the capsule is not intact. Borderline changes are there, but at where the invasion was, he cannot tell you because it's cut into pieces. So that's the challenge. That's the pathological challenge. Suppose there was micro invasion somewhere else, the tumor behavior will be different. Suppose it was a frank invasion somewhere else. Suppose the capsule was involved and breached by the tumor somewhere at a microscopic level by disease, then it is not 1A, then it is 1C2. So our disease staging also is compromised. Our disease histology and tumor type is also compromised. So that is why I said that we do, certain things. So larger tumors and younger people, we have to be more careful. I think a scar on the abdomen is not so much a challenge as a scar to life. So I remember 2.5 years back, I was referred a patient who underwent surgery, laparoscopic surgery for a 16 centimeter borderline ovarian tumor. And she, of course, there was no bag was used, and she kept on following post-op every 3 months on ultrasound and all. And everything was fine till 9 months, till little cyst started appearing in the right ovary. It was a cystectomy for a 16 centimeter lesion. Now, it was 2 to 3 centimeters, so it was thought maybe it's just a follicle. And, when it became 5-6 centimeters, she was referred. CA 125 was about 70. So at that stage, we took over, and, imaging, no peritoneal disease, no mental disease, everything done. I have all markers done, scopies done, everything done. And this was a mucinous lesion initially, mucinous borderline tumor. And again, a small line, no comment on invasion could be made because specimen was sent into multiple pieces. Now, I was like, okay, fine, we'll go ahead, we'll explore, we'll remove this. We did the counseling, consent, staging, laparotomy, assessment, plana, everything was done. When I opened the abdomen, it was a frozen abdomen. Extensive peritoneal disease, miliary, matlab 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter deposits splattered all over the bowel serosa, all over the mesentery, all over the peritoneum. And I could not even access that cyst. So I had to take biopsies and close. And of course, I realized the fact that this is going to be a challenge because these are the kind of tumors converted into a low-grade serous, basically, low-grade mucinous. So these are the kind of patients who will not respond well to chemo also. And, so much of serosal and mesenteric disease, unamenable to cytoreduction also. So we started chemo, and I think within 9 to 10 months of this episode, she just kept on deteriorating. She would not respond. She had distant mets. She had systemic disease. She kept on progressing despite all chemotherapy. 2-line failures, and she died. I can't forget her. She had a 5-year-old child. So, what little small decisions can influence our outcomes in a big way. So major challenges, what happened with laparoscopic surgeries in these situations are port site mets. and intraop spillage. And another one who actually had a recurrence at a port site was referred, and she had a carcinosarcoma after a borderline mucinous tumor. Despite surgical cytoreduction, but at surgical cytoreduction, the port site was not removed. And when she was, excised somewhere else and had a carcinosarcoma, but no chemotherapy was given. So no chemotherapy was given, no port site was removed. After that, 9 months after that recurrence, she came to me. And by that time, when I did a PET CT, she had lung mets. She was only 33. So whenever we spill, we change tumor biology. It is a known fact. We don't morcellate fibroids anymore. So we don't morcellate, or we don't even cut, because cutting is also morcellation in tumors. So we don't even cut ovarian tumors, because that changes the tumor biology, makes them more aggressive. And it's a well-known concept now in literature. And we send these patients for frozen section, and that's how we diagnose. And the sensitivity to pick up a borderline lesion, of course, there's a challenge with sensitivity. Larger lesions, because larger lesions, you have limitations. How much sections can you take? So that consent, we do try and make the family and the attendants and the patient herself, if she's a little, over 20 years of age, try and make them understand the challenges of doing a frozen section in such a large lesion. Now, lymphadenectomy, should you do a lymphadenectomy? Should you do lymph node removal or not? Of course, serious borderline tumors are associated with peritoneal disease. So definitive role of lymphadenectomy in borderline lesions is not established. It doesn't improve recurrences. So still a lot of debate in lymphadenectomy in borderline tumors. But of course, if you have larger nodes, debulking is essential. But one has to understand that all imaging has limited sensitivity, only 50 to 60% sensitivity in picking up nodal disease, even in established frank cancers. And we are seeing that every day. We are seeing patients with CTs, MRs, PET CTs. But when you actually open the retroperitoneum, you will see large 4.5 centimeter nodes, and sometimes even with disease. So I think it's a call that one has to take out of experience. So what about restaging? So many a times you have an 18-year-old or 16-year-old, parents are very confused. They don't know what to decide. You've told them so much about counseling, consent, this can happen, that can happen. We will try and do this. We will do a frozen section. They may say, don't do a frozen section. Just take the lesion out. We will wait for the final report. We want to take everything, we are not able to take a decision now. So that is acceptable in younger people. So if that has been done and one has to do a restaging, then that has to be advised with caution, looking at whether it's going to really benefit the patient or not. And especially mucinous tumors, if it won't impact much unless and until you see some evidence of disease anywhere else. So what are the histological features? You get not more than 4 mitosis per 10 high power field. You see mild nuclear atypia. You see epithelial multilayering more than 4 cell layers, increase in NC ratio, non-destructive stromal invasions. What we are looking for is destructive stromal invasion. That's a hallmark for invasive cancer. So again, when I said micropapillary serous borderline tumor is an interesting entity, must not be missed. So you see endosalpingiosis, you see area of micropapillary growth more than 5 mm maximum diameter, absence of stromal invasion, and an exophytic tumor. So recently I did a patient, she was 48, came with a large pelvic mass reaching up to the epigastrium, and it was about 13 centimeters lesion with probably a mucinous pathology, looking at the CT and everything. And when I did the ovarian laparotomy, then it was a large lesion which was densely adherent to the rectosigmoid, thin-walled, and probably had undergone some kind of infection and an abscess formation. So there was a lot of pus inside it. It came out to be a borderline seromucinous tumor. There was a similar lesion on exophytic lesion on the other ovary, which was only 2 centimeters. So these were bilateral borderline seromucinous tumors. So again, if you see in pregnancy a borderline tumor, what to do? Of course, try and delay till second trimester. The indications of surgery will be any size more than 6 centimeters, a complex lesion, presence of ascites, or if the lesion persists beyond 16 weeks till the placental function takes over. That means it was not a corpus this thing. So aggressive features, and one can actually do an upfront salpingoophorectomy and plan restaging later. So when you restage such patients, they may be upstaged in about 25% of patients. So of course, when I say fertility preservation or oncofertility, like Dr. Anita said, they are generally done for low risk tumors. And of course, 2 weeks prior to treatment, you have very good pregnancy success rates. Of course, with cryopreservation, and every woman, a young woman, will always dream of motherhood. So the challenge is the balance is between the fertility and survival. And of course, there are a lot of fertility preserving interventions. I'll just share quickly a case. And this is an oncofertility clinic concept, which we started and launched in Max Noida. This is a dedicated team of oncologists and fertility specialists. Of course, we do need sometimes in many challenges situations where you preserve the cryopreserve the oocytes and the embryos. So this was a 27-year-old unmarried girl who had undergone a laparoscopic right ovarian cystectomy in 2012, which came out borderline serous tumor, right? And it was reviewed. It was a borderline papillary serous tumor, possibly with microinvasion. No slides or blocks were available when she was sent to me. So she kept on following for 6 months, every 6 months till 2016. And she was referred to me, she had an 8 centimeter mass, right-sided, arising from the pelvis. And of course, she had a large lesion, 8 centimeters with some solid area and some vascularity. We did an MR where it was a right ovarian exophytic cyst. And of course, there were mural nodules and papillary projections. And CA125 was normal. So upper abdominal CT was also done. And when I counseled, this was done in the COVID times. So a lot of extensive counseling, of course, because of the pandemic also was done. So what I did is, because it was it was a 7-8 centimeters tumor, usually I would operate and only then send for a cryopreservation. There was a lot of discussion with this family, educated girl herself into medical field. So, she opted for her oocyte cryopreservation prior to surgery because
Good
we
evening.
were not sure it was a recurrent situation, for fertility or not. So we did a right salpingoophorectomy and a complete ovarian laparotomy with staging. And the final report also was a serous borderline tumor, micropapillary variant, on the same side as the previous one, right ovary, and it was a T1A-N0. So I did the lymphadenectomy also. I had discussed all the challenges with her. And, this girl is doing fine. It's been more than a year since her surgery has been done. And she's following up every 3 months. And for the first 2 years, we follow them 3 monthly, then 6 monthly for 3 years. Once they complete 5 years, then every year. And pelvic examination is, of course, the first mandate, followed by a ultrasound, including TVS and a CA125. So the interesting thing is, how does recurrence happen? So whether you're doing a cystectomy or a adnexectomy, and how much of disease are you actually doing and leaving behind in a cystectomy is important. If you've got invasive or non-invasive implants, have they been excised or not? So just like invasive cancers, it's important to remove all kind of disease, visible disease. So the prognostic factors are the type of histology, age, of course, surgical procedure undertaken, and the intraoperative spillage. Are you spilling it or not? Complete staging, is it an exophytic growth? What is the tumor volume? And micropapillary serous subtype. So my take-home messages will be that surgical treatment is the cornerstone for management. There's a shift in surgical treatment from radical to conservative or oncofertility kind of approach in younger people. The prognostic factors should be inserted into the overall treatment recommendations. We need to do a strict follow-up. We have higher recurrence rates after fertility sparing surgeries, but our survival doesn't go down. So we do not have to hesitate to offer this to our patients. And patient counseling with respect to family planning and oncological outcomes has to be balanced in case of survival as well as fertility in both aspects. So correct staging for borderline ovarian tumors is important. Cystectomy versus salpingo-oophorectomy is a crucial decision. Sparing fertility surgery is safe. Long-term follow-up is needed. And ovarian recurrences are infrequent. And if they are, they can be salvaged, like in this case, by surgery. So we do a fertility preservation surgery in stage 1, grade 2, and grade 3, even in clear cell and most of the stage 1C tumors as well. Particularly if they're germ cell tumors, we would like to go and do a fertility preservation most of the times because they're very, very responsive to treatment. If we are doing conservative surgery and we have access to the endometrial cavity, it's best to do an endometrial biopsy, particularly in endometrioid histology. And should a radical surgery be always indicated after completion of childbearing is a big question, but yes. And I'm going to do one more surgery of a girl whom I diagnosed to have a complex endometrial hyperplasia, very well differentiated adenocarcinoma at the age of 30. She was undergoing infertility treatment and she was a PCO. And when this couple came to me, they were devastated. They were married for 5 years, trying for a pregnancy for 2 years. And now there was a suspected, cancer for the endometrium. And we put them on high doses of megestrol acetate, 160 milligrams a day, 3 monthly hysteroscopies. After 9 months, complete resolution of atypia was there on the biopsy and hysteroscopy. And that was followed by an assisted reproduction, and she conceived in the first attempt. And now she's completed 2.5 years of having a child. I just met them today, actually, in the morning. And now they have planned, I offered them to have a second child if they want to complete the family, but they opted for a completion surgery right away. Well, initially, lactation was supporting her, but immediately after her delivery, a Mirena had been inserted, and that is being taken care of her. So she's undergoing her MRI tomorrow, on Monday, and then we will subsequently operate her next week. So thank you so much. And a little knowledge is definitely a dangerous thing, and so is a lot of knowledge. I'll just stop this here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and welcome comments.
Very nice presentation, Swasti. Sushma and Dr. Mrinali ma'am.
Yeah, wonderful talk. Congratulations, Dr. Swasti.
Thank you, ma'am.
Very nicely highlighted again, and case-wise that you were discussing. So everything done very nicely, especially the last one.
Thank you.
That is very good. Wonderful. The content was fabulous, and the oration was also wonderful.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, I would like to add here again, Dr. Swasti, once again, yes. Like you said, little knowledge is dangerous and a lot too. So yes. You could manage to convey the midway, the middle path. So we could gain that knowledge. As Buddha said, follow the middle path. So we have a middle path knowledge. And as you rightly said, in any women of ovarian masses which we come across, especially young ones, we must firstly order a TVS. So as to have a definitive, a more proper evaluation of the ovaries. And secondly, as you rightly mentioned, color Doppler is the next one, and MRI in younger patients. We straight away, because there's always a dilemma among the part like us, whether to get an MRI done or a CT scan done. So what we gather and the take-home message is MRI is a better modality. Only when it's a proven malignancy for staging, we need a CT or a PET-CT. And also, like we have to go for younger patients, we do have to offer them fertility preservation, but at the same time, counseling is the most important part, and we have to counsel them. Like you mentioned, this patient who wants a definitive surgery now in the second stage, once her family is completed, she doesn't want to take a risk in future. That has to be taken care of. And also, like in borderline cancers, we have to be very careful. And like you mentioned, laparoscopically, everybody wants to be minimally invasive these days. And patients are also very happy. There's no scar, chota sa hai, acha sa ho gaya, recovery is good. But at the same time, we have to take care of the spillage which is there. And rightly mentioned, we do not have invasion because we don't have a capsule, we don't have tissue. So we have to take care while offering conservative surgery, open surgery versus the laparoscopy, minimally invasive. So I think I would personally, in such cases, would counsel more towards open surgery.
Open surgery, right.
Dr. Swasti, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Kalpana. Nice to hear from you.
Dr.
Please,
Swasti, there
Yes,
is
ma'am.
always a dilemma. Which
Yes, ma'am.
patient of ovarian tumor should be operated by a conventional gynecologist and which should be referred to a oncosurgeon? So there should be clear-cut guidelines, protocol rather, I should say. There should be
Yes, ma'am.
clear-cut protocol, and I would like to you to highlight those protocol and which should be taken into consideration for operating by a conventional gynecologist.
Sure, ma'am. I did not deliberately talk about the guidelines, the ACOG and the SGO guidelines, because they are more for invasive epithelial ovarian cancers. Because I was talking on borderline tumors, but of course, whenever I talk on adnexal masses, there are 3-4 things which we need to do for our patients. Whenever we are doing imaging, it has to be very comprehensively assessed. I never go by the report. That's the dictum. So we have we as gynecologists have always been trained to looking into MRIs more than CTs. The surgeons were always developed into looking at CTs more than MRIs because they were looking at bowel and obstruction.
Yes.
And we were always looking at cervix and endometrium and ovaries. So cervix, endometrium, ovaries is best assessed by MR. Always must look at the films ourselves. Once we start doing that, we will know which are the cases which need the intervention of an oncology team. We will understand because we will know this is neural nodules, these are the thickenings, these are septations, these are complex lesions, these are papillary projections. We will be able to identify on our own. See, on ultrasound, it's difficult because ultrasound is a real-time imaging. But whenever you have a higher imaging modality like an MR or a CT being done, then of course you have so much access to CDs, to films, to packs. Now things are easier. Even anybody has an MR or a CT done in a periphery, everybody is carrying at least some films, good quality films. Most people are carrying. So I always insist that I would want to see the patient and the films. Second thing is CA-125. Though we know it is not a diagnostic tool, we know its value is only prognostic, but it has been used as a modality to calculate risk of malignancy index, particularly in postmenopausal women. So in postmenopausal women, the score automatically is 3 for postmenopausal women, and you multiply it by the value of CA-125 and you multiply the score of the ultrasound findings
that we do RMI index
RMI
dose.
calculation.
Yes.
So any CA-125 of more than 200 or an RMI more than 200 warrants a gyne-oncology intervention and association. So what we have started doing at our center is whenever these kind of things are present or there, they will always send them to me for a pre-op consult. We will sit and jointly talk to them, jointly operate them, and that gives the best way because that way the patient knows what will happen. Now suppose if I'm just called into theater and a frozen section shows malignancy and there is no consent to proceed, then I will not be able to help the patient. So after all these kind of situations that we have faced on many occasions, we have realized it is best to do whatever you can do pre-op. So there is a lot of emphasis on telling people what will happen after frozen section is borderline, what will happen after frozen section. So you imagine a parent situation who is whose daughter is 21, just graduated and trying to do a MBA or something and getting a job, and the world is full of dreams for her, and suddenly she has a 12 centimeter mass which is query borderline or query malignant, and you say you're going to cut open the abdomen vertically. Almost 30 minutes I have to explain to them why I want to do a midline incision. I have to tell them that why I want to access the upper abdomen, why it is important not to give a bikini incision or a Fannin steel. So that is how the approach changes when a gyne-oncologist gets involved. So I would suggest for patients, it is always better that we work as teams whenever there is any suspicion which is arising, because that way our patients get the best of both worlds. They will get the experience of the general gynecologist and the experience of the gyne-oncologist together. So all that comes in one go, and the criteria for referral are abnormal imaging, CA-125 more than 200 or RMI more than 200, and presence of ascites is very, very ominous sign that should never be ignored. and whatever looks as malignancy may not always turn out to be malignancy. It can also come out to be an abdominal tuberculosis.
Yes,
That is my very strong message, because they just mimic. They just mimic. You will see peritoneal disease, you will see mesenteric disease, you will see lymph nodes, you will see thickening, you will see your mental nodularity, and everywhere TB test also may be negative. You may or may not be lucky enough to pick a granuloma, and CA-125 I have seen as high as 2,000-3,000 in women with tuberculosis. These are challenges but we have to biopsy, we have to exclude malignancy, try and do a non-invasive image guided biopsy if you can. If you can't and the access is not there, then a laparoscopic biopsy definitely.
So this is okay that we should calculate RMI, and if it comes out to be below 200, we should operate. Otherwise, we should refer these cases
so ma'am, even if it comes out 180, but you think that your imaging is sinister, then I mean, see, 200 is a cutoff which is given in guideline. But I always say that if you have any one of the things which is higher, either a tumor marker is abnormal or an imaging modality shows something abnormal, then either of these things, please get a pre-op consult. Gynae-oncologists are always.
And these ovarian masses tend to be, they play hide and seek. So many times you see some so small ovarian cyst coming out to be malignant, actually. The retrospective when we get a histopath.
I've seen
so
4
one has to be very careful.
As granulosa cell tumors. You will not see a solid component also. You will see a whole cystic, very cystic component, and that's it.
Then during surgery, we have to very meticulously. Sorry, Dr. Anita. Just one point I wanted to make was like whenever, like we as a non-oncologist are doing surgery, we must be very meticulous in recording our per-operative findings. Actually, what all we found, and try to just always put a hand on the liver and see, and always take a peritoneal washings and everything, even for a very small ovarian cyst we are operating, like we always do. And unfortunately, in most of the centers, we don't have frozen section facilities available. And if we are not equipped, I think we should be referring a patient, not to be playing with the patient life. So, yes, Dr. Anita, sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kalpana, for that question. Interesting question. I just wanted to say that Swasti has brought out a very important carry-home message, because tuberculosis can mimic any kind of malignancy. We have seen services which looked malignant, but it came out to be tuberculosis or cervix. So a very important carry-home message has been given. I can see Dr. Raj Bokaria here. Ma'am has been my guru, and I want to make, ma'am, please make some comment about these presentations. Dr. Raj, ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Ma'am, namaskar.
Namaskar, Swasti.
Ji, ma'am.
Excellent presentation by both. By Anita also, though I missed her because I was busy in doing the OPD, but I couldn't resist listening to you. It was an excellent, and I can understand because I have also seen the borderline tumor in young unmarried girl, where I took her up for laparoscopy, and the CT was pointing toward the endometrioma, and it was a OT technician's daughter, unmarried. And then looking at the laparoscopy, I thought it is very unusual, very vascular, something wrong. I called the histopathologist also, but they couldn't say. And being unmarried, I didn't do the oophorectomy. So we did a cystectomy as much as possible, and it turned out to be a granular cell tumor. And then we had a staging laparotomy, fertility preserving unilateral salpingo-oophorectomy, and that was done by Dr. Rama Joshi along with me. And then she got married. She had 2 children. After that, I have lost follow-up because now I don't go to Moolchand. But it is it is a real dilemma when there is a borderline suspicious.
Right.
So an excellent presentation by both. I missed Anita, your distinct
Anita, I also missed yours one, but halfway I joined. It was excellent. But Dr. Swasti, excellent. Anita, but later on I heard, but it was excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Swasti, I know from Max only. And she's a very good surgeon also. You're that
So
patient.
Dr. Surjit also. Dr. Surjit, ma'am, Dr. Surjit, please make a comment, Surjit Di. Dr. Surjit has been my senior and I see her in delegates. Dr. Surjit, you want to add anything? Please unmute yourself, Surjit Di. I think she's not there. So over to Mrinalini ma'am and Sushma ji, you want to make any final comment?
Yeah, no, congratulations once again, and wonderful deliberations. We really are enlightened, and the delegates would be really, benefited from this wonderful talk. So very nicely done. And we look forward to many more, webinars together and many more associations. Definitely, that's for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Swasti. Thank you for everything. Thank you, Mitali. Swasti, you can give a formal vote of thanks.
Sure. So my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Anita. Ma'am has been there always around me. I always feel that warmth, that blanket of warmth around me whenever she's there. And thank you so much, DGF Southwest and the Reproductive Endocrinology Committee, AOGD, and all our guest of honors, Dr. Achla Batra ma'am, Dr. Jyotsna Suri ma'am, for guiding us through and encouraging us to take these important, pertinent issues for women's health. And my heartfelt thanks also to Dr. Mrinalini Mani ma'am, Dr. Shushma Sinha ma'am, to Dr. Leena Sridhar ma'am, to Dr. Shashi ma'am. They could not join, but my heartfelt thanks to them. And I hope that whatever endeavors they are taking at the moment, they are successful in those.
They have sent best wishes, both Dr. Shashi and Leena, because they are taking care of their parents who have undergone vaccination today.
Yeah.
So they could not join. They have conveyed their best wishes to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you also to Torrent Viva, Abhijit, Mitali, Nitin, Omveer, everybody for their unending support. And I think a lot of support from them has led to a lot of academic work this year, particularly in the COVID times. Thank you so much, Torrent Viva.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mrinalini ma'am, Sushma, Mitali.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.
And to all the delegates and seniors who were there throughout and who were, blessing us with their valuable comments and sharing their very valuable experiences through their long careers of hard work. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Okay. So I'll end the session now.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye. Bye.